Okay, everyone, I guess we'll get started. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're all happy to be here and speaking with you. Myself and my fellow panelists, we're all part of the CanBIM Legal Committee. So I'll take some time and introduce all of us to you. And if you've got questions at any time during our presentation, please feel free to ask, stop us, and ask your questions at that time. So first I have Jason Lewis, who is from WSP. He's in-house counsel there. I should say we're all lawyers. So prepare to either fall asleep or... Yeah. So Jason Lewis is Senior Legal Counsel at WSP Canada, where he provides legal guidance to operations professionals, supports the negotiation, review, and execution of RFPs, proposals, contracts, and subcontracts. He identifies and advises on commercial risk and liabilities. And prior to that, Jason was legal counsel to Ivanhoe Cambridge, and then before that worked for the region of Halton as assistant corporate counsel. And then we have Peter Dempster from Aon. He is Aon's National Director of Commercial and Performance Security. His experience includes operational management, surety claims management, and mitigation and reinsurance market management and support. Prior to joining Aon, Peter was the Director of Surety Operations for Western Canada with Intact, and before that he was with Travelers in the Surety and Warranty Group. Then we have Catherine MacInnis. She is Associate General Counsel at IBI Group. She has significant experience providing practical legal advice to international clients on a broad range of litigation matters, including complex design disputes. Catherine is accountable for managing IBI Group's risk portfolio worldwide, and prior to joining IBI, she practiced law at a leading full-service law firm and a prominent securities litigation boutique in Toronto. And then me, I'm from Glaholt LLP. It's a construction litigation boutique here in Toronto. We act for everyone in the construction chain, from owners to suppliers. And with that, we'll get into our presentation. So just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. I'll be speaking about BIM contracts, giving an overview of what things look like globally, and some of the concerns that arise with respect to BIM and legal issues. Then Peter will be speaking about BIM cyber risk from an insurance perspective. Jason will then examine the intersection of risk associated with BIM and design professions from an in-house legal perspective. And Catherine will be talking about how design professionals can use BIM and related technologies to reduce risk on projects. And so we started thinking about the theme of this presentation. And so the question that we're mulling is, we've got BIM, it's new technology. What are the risks like? Are they the same? Are they different? And so my first presentation, I'll submit that the risks are essentially the same, even though we're dealing with new technology. I'm sure you'll hear some different viewpoints from Peter, Jason, and Catherine. So I start with, from the dawn of time, there have been designers designing spaces, creating and imagining spaces, and builders making those spaces come to life based on the designs. And I was speaking with someone who's in the audience today last night about how when I was in architecture school years ago, we were encouraged to do everything by hand. We had a 1.5 year course on CAD. I go back to my old school now and I take a look around, everything is done digitally. 2D CAD is sort of a thing of the past in terms of presentation, and now you're seeing things in a 3D visualization. However, in my view, despite the increased use of digital technology, I think it's still the case that designers design and builders build. But the tools are changing. And so this is an image from a paper that came out, a study that was done in 2017. It just shows the status of BIM adoption globally. And so, as you all know, BIM has been touted as this tool which allows project participants to work more collaboratively, deliver workflow processes with fewer errors, and improve on schedule and performance. So increasing awareness about BIM is leading to its increased growth in use around the world. And so back in 2016, the global demand for BIM market was valued at $3.5 billion, and it is expected to reach $10.4 billion by 2022. And from an Altus Group real estate development study, BIM was described as one of the 3 most disruptive influences heading the industry's way. And so we can see from this map, and I'm sure things have advanced a bit since 2017, but there are European and Asian countries that are quite advanced in their BIM adoption. Here, our rate of adoption is still roughly around 30% with the Canadian industry using BIM, and there's been no government or federal mandate with respect to BIM. So that's a bit different than some of the other jurisdictions around the world. What we know is, now everyone's starting to think a little bit more internationally and developing their standards. So the ISO 19650 came out earlier this year. Again, trying to create international standards that apply to the use of BIM and set out frameworks for that use. And so globally, we also have various contracts that organizations have created. And these standard form contracts are great in that, a lot of questions have been raised about the use of BIM, right? It's a different kind of tool. How do we use it? Who's liable for certain components of the model? Will builders be tagged with design liability and so forth? So these associations and organizations have put their collective brains towards considering all of these issues and have come up with various standard form contracts. So this is a list that was taken from a paper. It's a 2008 paper, it is not a 2008 paper. I don't know why that is, because they wouldn't have 2013 and 2015 dates, but so my data's wrong there. But this is essentially a snapshot of what is available globally. Of course, we've got updates to the AIA document and the consensus document that came out, I believe, last year. But the one thing that's not on this list is the Canadian IBC BIM contract appendix, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But so some of the, all of these contracts consider the same themes or the same issues. And this is why these standard form contracts are great when you've got BIM planned for the use of projects, right? Because if you've got a concern, somehow, somewhere, it's been raised in one of these standard form contracts, right? So, and these tools are there so that the parties don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they approach a project with BIM. And it may not provide you with a prescription for what the parties are going to do, but it will at least trigger parties to think about how they should interact with each other and how or what the model can be used for, right? There'll be, if the contract doesn't prescribe something, certainly it will have a blank spot for people to put down what applies to them in that particular project. So the common elements of all of these contracts, the first one is that they all sort of speak to liabilities of the party. And it goes to that first comment that I made. Designers aren't going to be relieved from their design obligations, and other parties who are on the contractor side, their contributions will not be considered design services. All of these standard form contracts will set out the scope and model requirements. So many of these contracts will have specific definitions of elements and levels of development, of modeling, criteria, and authorized use. All of these contracts will require that a BIM management and execution plan be signed. And again, they might not be prescribing one for the parties, but at least will trigger the parties to say, yes, I need to have one of those in place in order to proceed with this contract. Reliance. So, for lawyers, this is key. What can you rely on the BIM model for? What can you use it for? And anything, it's it's key to say anything that is sort of outside of that scope of authorized use is not permitted and is at the person's own risk. So standard contracts will also deal with BIM ownership and IP rights. And most contracts will follow the protocol that the IP rights of a particular model element will stay with the author, but licenses are given to other people participating in the modeling to use that contributor's model elements. Interoperability and compatibility. So the contracts will define the BIM software and specify how data is to be transmitted. And finally, security, which Peter will be getting into a little bit later. But contracts will define efforts that must be taken to address security issue and who is responsible for managing these aspects. So as I mentioned, here in Canada, we've got our IBC contract appendix. It sort of takes from the AIA document and the consensus document. It's been endorsed by a number of professional organizations and even referenced in some of the standard form contracts that are currently available. So I don't know if you can read it, but if you've never dealt with this contract, I mean, it's a very straightforward 7-page, I think, document that is meant to be appended to the prime contract. So I urge you, if you haven't taken a look at it, to really read it, and it makes sense, and it follows along with all of the other key elements that I was saying the international contracts have. So the first section, the general section, that'll provide a sort of overview of all of the parties' roles and responsibilities, an agreement that everyone who is signing on to this project will sign this BIM appendix, and that's key, right? So that everyone is on, the same playing field. The second section deals with copyright issues. The third, again, very important, talks about risk and reliance, and there it'll set out in detail, again, what level you're going to be able to get to, what you're going to be able to rely on that for, and any unauthorized use is going to be at your own risk. The fourth and fifth sections deal, these are the parts that have fillable spaces, right? And so here it just helps to turn the parties' minds to these issues. So, perhaps the appendix won't give you the prescription, but it is helpful in that, hey, these are things that are going to come up, and the parties better put their minds to it and think about it before the project starts. And as I was saying, so some of the standard form contracts that we have in the industry on the construction side or on the consultant side do reference this IBC contract appendix. So you take a look at the new CCDC 30 that came out, I believe, last year. This is the contract for IPD, right? So IPD, for those that have not embarked on an IPD project, it is growing in popularity, and I think the idea of IPD certainly works really well with BIM, right? Because it's a multi-party contract. It's about collaboration, which are sort of the similar ideas that you get with BIM. And so 1.1.6, 1.1.7 here on the screen talk about copyright issues and what the owner can use the design instruments for, or the drawings and the plans. Except when you get to 1.1.9, here we say, but if the parties are agreeing to use BIM, then Schedule F applies. Then you flip the page and what does Schedule F say? And there it's just a little note that says, insert your IBC BIM contract appendix here. Right? So at least now it's triggering the parties to think about, oh yes, if I'm using BIM, again, I need something to guide what I am doing so that all the parties have a basic understanding of how they're going to interact with each other, who's responsible for what, to what level of development, at what milestone. And I raise this also to say that the RAIC, the newest version of it that came out last year, also has a reference to the IBC BIM contract appendix. So at least these two organizations, the CCDC and the RAIC, are contemplating that you're going to be using the IBC contract appendix when you embark on BIM with a project. And the one thing that we might want to do, and I think there will likely be discussion in the next couple of years, is now that we've developed this, or sorry, not we, but now that the international body has developed the new ISO that has come out, we might be looking at the IBC contract appendix to update it. Right? It's 2014 document. Perhaps it's time for a refresh there. So, certainly, as the industry, I would push for it and hope that comes out within the next couple of years. So to close out my section, we took a look at the second annual BIM report that was prepared by University of Toronto, partnering with ResCon and the Toronto BIM community. And they surveyed about 400 respondents, and I noted that legal issues doesn't seem to rank high in terms of what people's perception of barriers to the use of BIM was. And not to talk ourselves out of continuing to be here and present to you all, but I just note that we are noticing that perhaps Canada is not as quick to adopt BIM as other jurisdictions, and we wondered if it really had to do with fear of new risks, fear of expanded liability. But at least in the industry, there doesn't seem to be that extreme fear that we hear about. People seem to be more concerned, at least on the corporate issue side, about return on investment, lack of senior management support, lack of in-house experience, and then you come down to legal issues. And then when you look at it you break it down by discipline, I don't even think legal issues shows up on this. So thank you all for being here despite your lack of interest. But this report really does reflect what we're seeing in the industry. I've said it before, and every time we present on these issues, I do a quick check of Westlaw and Canley to see if I can find any BIM litigation that's out there. And really, there is it's like a black hole of the issues that get litigated in construction. And it's not to say that there are no cases out there, and maybe there are cases that are dealt with by way of private arbitration, so they're not reported. But certainly out of the publicly available decisions, what we do know about any cases that involve BIM, and I've only been able to find a handful, like literally 5. But all of the issues really stem from contractual disputes about extras. Or I think in a recent, it's a February 2019 decision that came out on a TTC project, they're arguing there about delays and deficiencies. And so the model featured only as a way in litigation to help the parties examine the deficiencies and the delays. So it wasn't an issue that came up during the construction, it was sort of after the fact. Now people are fighting about more money. So it's come up there. And then the other case that came out in the UK recently, it was either last year or the year before, that had to do with, again, payment of fees. The model creator said, I'm not giving you access until you pay me all my extra fees, which were being disputed. And so there the court said, okay, just pay the fees into court, and then the company can get access to it again. So again, these things are not BIM related, right? Like I haven't seen anything that says, okay, mechanical contractor, you contributed this bit of information to the model, therefore now, you're going to get sued for some kind of design issue. Haven't seen that. So I think that takes it back to the statements that I made at the outset where, design is design and building is the building, and so far we haven't seen BIM expand the risk in that regard. And I think, too, particularly where you have all of these standard form contracts available to you, it would really be helpful to get all the parties' expectations aligned and to use those tools that are available. And with that, so now I've ended on an optimistic, positive note. We'll have Peter here to give you the gloom and doom.
Thanks. So, Andrea's not wrong. First of all, good morning. And thanks again for coming in at 8:30 to talk to four lawyers. I want to talk a little something it's tangential to BIM, but I think it's an important item to think about over the next few years, because just what's happening for what we see in the industry. And I think if we looked 3, even 5, well, for sure 5 years ago, cyber risk was not as prominent as it is now. But it's becoming such an issue that it's something that we see pretty much every single week. So I wanted to start off, I do have a bunch of doom and gloom slides, but I want to start off on a positive note. That this change is coming. The BIM is going to be the model going forward in a number of ways. And I think the opportunity to manage it is now in terms of risk. So with that, I just want to start with a little bit of a discussion about the prominence of cyber losses in Canada, in North America. So we've compiled quite a bit of data on this, and as early as 2015 to 2016, there was almost a 400% rise in the number of cyber incidents with architects, engineers, and builders. More recently, and I think this is 2018 data, there's almost a 93% occurrence in our survey data for those who have faced a cyber issue of some kind in the last year, in addition to very high potential fraud issues as well. So this is it's a very common issue. It's extremely common, and in some of this data, there's companies that have been hit more than once in a single year for sure, but it is incredibly prominent these days, and it's often not a risk that's thought about by construction, engineering, and architecture firms. So what makes it such a prime target for cyber? There's a number of things. The utilization of cloud is a big one in terms of BIM, but also having a centralized data point where there's multiple user access to the same source of information, or where there's information being compiled centrally. So I just want to talk about what are the typical sources of cyber losses. By far, the most common are actual malicious attacks against companies. It forms about 47%. Accidental disclosure is also probably the second most common one. That's where somebody accidentally sends data to a third party, accidentally publishes data, or accidentally sends an email to their friend with information that should have been kept confidential. Social engineering is also on the rise in terms of an exposure. That's where a good example of that is fake emails that pose as internal emails that cause finance departments to say paychecks where they shouldn't go. Portable devices are down at 6%, and then the very last is physical loss of non-electric records. This is the one where we typically see contractors, builders in particular, are the strongest, because everybody knows how to. Excuse me. Yeah. Come on in, find a seat. This is where we see, generally speaking, contractors are the strongest, because everybody knows how to lock toolboxes, everybody knows to put a password on your home computer and on your business computer, but it's by far the least common way that we see losses in the cyberspace. So generally speaking, what cyber attacks are after when it comes to companies is employee data. It's incredibly valuable. Access, obviously, to any confidential information that's held. Corporate data for competitive advantage. This is becoming a very large issue, in particular in Europe and the Middle East, and as well as cyber terrorism, again, same location. The increased exposure for a BIM model here is things like rapid transit, any sort of information about structuring of potential hard and soft targets for terrorism. Okay. So what does this all have to do with BIM? So because BIM generally is an emerging technology with different adoptions around the world and different modes of protecting the data, it's seen as a vulnerability. Because there's distributed access and multiple accesses by different organizations with different levels of sophistication around their data security, it's considered there's a multiplier of the vulnerability. Really, you're only strong as your weakest link. If you are a multinational engineering firm with very strong data protection practices, you are going to be fine, probably. But if you are dealing with an HVAC contractor that is 17 guys in the middle of Kentucky, which was the case in the Target loss, that's your weakest link that creates exposure. The ability to inflict harm is fairly high. Now, this is not just BIM. This is other sources, because contractors, in particular builders, usually deal with large sums of money moving in and out on a regular basis. There's an ability to do very significant damage in what are called ransomware attacks, as well as withholding. The other one is with ransom is withholding access to information. So in a situation where there's a ransomware attack over a BIM model and it's prevented you from advancing a project or advancing the design, there can be significant delay damages. And so the last one, the BIM model may be the target or the point of entry is a better way of looking at it. But the typical approach in cyber attacks is to use an entrance point, spend time finding what's the most valuable, and then carrying out the activity on that most valuable point. And so that's more of the concern that we see, is that more and more we're seeing cyber attacks where they'll sit inside a system for 12 to 18 months before they actually do something malicious. Okay. So what are the loss outcomes? So the most common, data system ransoms. For 2019, this is far and away the biggest issue. This is where a system is locked down or threatened to be destroyed in exchange for the payment of cash. Data destruction is the next step off that, when you can't pay a ransom, or if somebody wants to just destroy data, that is the next one. And the last one is data theft. So I'll just end. I've got a couple slides here. I want to talk about some of the contractual issues that come out of this. First one, in terms of how the contracts are structured, there is significant exposure to delay damages depending on where you are in the vertical. This is due to late delivery of drawings if there is a lengthy period of time which you cannot access and work on the BIM model. There's potential work stoppages depending on at what point in the process a cyber attack occurs. Breach of confidentiality provisions, depending on what type of work you're working on. Again, there may be significant confidentiality issues around this if there's potential publication of any data. And depending on how your contract is structured, it could actually be a fundamental default of your contract. The other one that I think doesn't really come up very often in terms of people's thought about these things, but is a significant issue since 2018. Privacy Act was reformed such that there's now specific breach requirements. If you're subject to a cyber attack in which results in personal information being disclosed, that you have specific notification requirements, potential breach damages, as well as fines and penalties to the privacy officer for not managing your data properly, as well as public reputational damages. When I say the target loss, most people go, oh yeah, the target loss, where 141 million customers lost data. That's something that's going to sit on Target's record for a long time. So anyway, just wanted my inspirational closing quote was, we ignore the risks that are hardest to measure even when they pose the greatest threats to our well-being. I think that's sort of encapsulate the cyber risk right now, is that it's often ignored because it's difficult to think about and quantify. Everyone changes their password once in a while. They think that's good enough, but it really isn't. There's quite a risk out there. So with that, pass it to Jason.
Before we start, if anybody wants to take a minute after Peter's presentation to turn Siri off on their phone, I won't be insulted. As Andrea said, my name is Jason Lewis. I'm a lawyer with WSP Canada. I'm Chief Counsel to our buildings business line, serving about 1,800 employees from coast to coast. Today, I'm going to discuss BIM risk in general, give an overview of certain legal concerns. We'll go from there. So first question is, why BIM? But I think we should work backwards and we should say, well, why not BIM? Okay, why should we not be using BIM? So incorporating BIM in a project because BIM sounds cool, or because the other company down the road is doing BIM, well, that's never a good idea. As well, BIM is not appropriate for every project. It needs to find itself in an environment where it makes sense. So it's suitable for collaborative delivery models like DB, CM, or as Andrea mentioned, IPD, where contractors and design professionals can work together to develop a project scope and do it in consideration of each. In other situations, the complexity of a project makes BIM's functionality an essential component. So, for example, thinking about a football stadium or a hospital, those are great situations where you want to consider BIM. So before I continue, I just want to thank the good folks at CanBIM for providing us with a list of all confirmed attendees here in the room. And with that, can I ask, is Mr. Daniel Doherty in the audience today? Okay, he was supposed to be, but I'm glad he's not, because the next portion of my presentation is actually taken from an article that he wrote. This is from his article, Spelling BIM with 5 T's. And what Daniel does, it's great. He takes the McLeamy curve, which illustrates that the further into a project timeline, the more costly in terms of time and money change to become. And he restates that principle far more clearly. He says, it's really a case of give a little now for a whole lot later. And I think as BIM professionals, that's sort of how we see the benefit of what we're trying to do. Yes, clearly we're front-loading our projects in terms of time and resources, but the cost savings that we'll hopefully realize later on certainly justify what we're trying to do. So the idea here is that there can be some resistance from owners. They see... Interesting ringer. The idea here is that there can be some resistance from owners when they see how many resources are going to be required at the early stages. And yes, when you ask for advice and content early from the team, it may cost you more in terms of time, in terms of manpower, but you're always going to make up for it in terms of productivity or downstream utility. Now, here in my presentation, I would ask Daniel if he had anything to add. He's not here, so we'll just continue. And with that, I'm going to go to the overview of legal concerns. And when I hear about new technologies, new ways of thinking, people assume that lawyers get a bit nervous. In fact, this is an actual quote from one of the articles that I reviewed in preparation for today. If you thought the design and building industry was stodgy when it came to accepting a new paradigm, then the legal world is downright Neanderthal. Change adverse, risk adverse, and suspicious of anything upsetting the well-worked methods and comfortable apple cart that has defined the legal process of the building industry for almost a century. Well, I was taken aback when I read this passage, and I'll be honest with you. You know what I thought? I thought, finally someone understands me. So the diagram behind Andrea may look complex, maybe even a little paranoid, but I assure you that this is how a lawyer thinks. BIM has a multitude of legal concerns. When we talk about BIM, I get nervous about obligations, about your duty of care, about what we're going to do with tools. Cybersecurity was relatively low on my list after Peter's presentation. I'm paranoid. I also worry about things like jurisdiction and consideration. Who's gonna pay for all of this? So let's talk first about ownership and control of BIM models. So first and foremost, who's going to have ownership to all or part of the model? And if no one actually says anything, who's going to be responsible to assert that right? If no one is proactive in asserting that ownership, does the default ownership go to all the parties, or does it wrap up to the owner? And what about IP rights? Do the parties intend that the IP will be shared by all the parties in the team? Maybe, but what's going to be the limit of that sharing? And what I mean by that is, is the sharing going to be within the four corners of the project, or are we going to let the IP be ported to other opportunities? That's when I start getting nervous. And what about the provision of native files to the other parties? Do we care that third parties now have the ability to manipulate our raw data? Turning to risk allocation and risk carriage, who ultimately is going to take ownership for the design, and how are you going to ensure that responsibility is shifted or moves as the BIM model evolves? In my opinion, maybe the parties would benefit from setting a limit to the extent upon which the BIM model can actually be relied upon. Standard of care is also important. When parties in my opinion, when parties participate in a BIM project, I think there's a general supposition that everyone knows what they're doing. And sometimes it's just not the case. In other cases, because the understanding of BIM can vary between parties and is therefore inconsistent, the depth of information, well, that's going to vary as well. And so if we have differing levels of understanding, what is the duty of care of the design professional when taking on the BIM project? Because if everyone's understanding of BIM is slightly nuanced, and typically that's the case, it's going to be difficult to confirm that all parties are working to the same standard. And then the question is, well, what is the obligation of one party to verify the raw data of another? I assume we're all professionals, but conversely, if no cross-checks occur and inaccuracies are passed from one modeler to another modeler, the final project outcomes will certainly be affected. And then the question is going to be, well, who's responsible, or who should be held responsible for relying upon insufficient information? Jurisdiction. This one is interesting for a number of reasons, but given that information coming into the BIM model is going to come from a multitude of jurisdictions, it could be different provinces, it could be different countries, how can you ensure that the model itself will be subject to a singular legal system? I think an important question is, are there any legal systems you're going to want to avoid? Just flat out, if some information is coming from a place that you know is problematic, don't put it in your contract. And then the question is, well, how are inputs from different standards, how are they going to be integrated? Tools, very quickly. I noted earlier that various inputs from the BIM model will invariably come from different sources. And I guess the challenge for the design team is going to be to integrate those inputs. And at first blush, I think that this appears to be an innocuous task and any party can assume it. However, is this something that you would want to take responsibility for? And I ask you that because, if you take that responsibility, what happens if the task takes far longer than expected? Here's an important question that a lawyer might not ask you, but I'll ask you, is that work billable? And if it isn't billable, did you just agree to erode all your margins? That's a really important consideration. I assume most of us are here, not because we work for free. And lastly, as part of a BIM project, a number of tools, product-specific or not, they might be purchased. So the question I have is, who's going to pay for those tools and who's going to be given use or access to those tools? Then, once the project is over, what do you do with these tools? Who gets to keep them? Do you throw them out? I don't know. Anyhow, I've gone on long enough, so I'm going to turn the floor over to our next speaker, Catherine MacInnis, Associate Counsel at IBI Group. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks to CanBIM for having me and for you all for being here this morning. My name is Catherine MacInnis. I'm Associate General Counsel at IBI Group, Inc. And a little disclaimer, before I was an in-house lawyer, I was in private practice and I sued a lot of architects and engineers and design professionals. So I know this from both sides fairly well. I'm also happy to be here today to talk about BIM because I think it's mostly a good news story in terms of how to manage risk. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can sell this internally and to your insurance companies. There we go. This is more about IBI in case you didn't know about us. And our IBI team, so our BIM team we're now 100% BIM design in 2019. That's probably the most important for today. Our BIM team is led by Brent Mouty globally, and he's done a really good job at educating us all internally, as well as educating our insurance companies on how BIM can improve on risk. So I've learned a lot about what I'm going to talk about today from Brent. From a legal and ops perspective, the most important takeaway about BIM for me is that it reduces the costs on the project and the delivery, and then also it reduces the liability on the back end. So it makes BIM good to work with on a project that you can conceptualize, visualize, collaborate, all those things, reduce liability over time. And when you reduce liability, you make your insurers happy. So the construction industry generally is very litigious. Insurance companies have been having like 8- and 9-figure losses, and they're pissed off, quite frankly. And so it's become an insurance market that's very hard. They don't take on as much risk as they used to, the insurance companies, and so you have to prove to your insurer that you're doing a good job managing risk. And one of the things we've managed to convince them of is that BIM is a really good way to manage risk. So it's one way to set yourself apart from your competitors, is to sell that, and that's certainly a good thing for you to be selling internally because it reduces premiums, which are very expensive. So here's an overview of a little bit more about what I'll be talking about. The first thing is more flattering stuff about BIM. The next is I'll talk about some technologies that work well with BIM, emerging technologies like smart contracts and robotic process automation. And then I'll look at the trends in litigation. And like Andrea, I always Google before I come and give a presentation to make sure nothing changed since the last time. And this time when I looked up, there were a few more cases that actually mention BIM, but it mentions BIM in an evidentiary context, which means that the judge is relying on BIM information to make a decision about something else. And that's good news. That means it's a reliable technology and that the judiciary in Ontario in particular are accepting it. The last one, managing the risks. The theme here is that like no technology can replace your common sense. You're still required to do all the things you were required to do before on projects. It's just that now you have this other tool. So when risk managers, which is an exciting title, for lawyers and insurers, when we look at things, this is what we consider, is that clash detection, that's huge. The ability to fix problems before you pour concrete saves a lot of money. And improved quality control, of course, that's an obvious one. And then visualization. So you'd be surprised, but when you're working with not sophisticated clients or unsophisticated clients, their ability to conceptualize or visualize from a 2D model is pretty poor. So there's actually lawsuits about visualization, and so clients get a building that they weren't expecting, which is terrible. So the visualization helps both with engagement and then also in terms of lawsuits on the back end. And in terms of rapidity, I would say that being able to do things quickly, of course, is better. You have more time to deal with the issues as they arise. So I was speaking with one of our BIM professionals last week, and he mentioned that on something that would take like an architect 10 hours who isn't trained in BIM, a BIM professional can help them in under an hour. So making sure you're selling that internally to your teams, and also educating people in your company who don't know what they're doing in BIM, making sure that they're relying on BIM professionals to do the work. So this is a chart that I share on every presentation. But I realized last night when I was preparing that there's something missing from this chart. There's nothing about BIM technology here. But it would fit somewhere between PCs and the internet. About 1987, I think when AutoCAD was sort of first coming up, that's when you would put the BIM date in. And one of the other questions I get asked sometimes is what other technology would I compare BIM to? And the one that I say usually is a calculator. And that's because it enables people to do things more quickly, more efficiently. The numbers are better than when you were using an abacus, perhaps. And I have a fair amount of experience with calculators. My dad was a calculator salesman when I was a kid, and so we had these like old ones that look like cash registers in our basement, which I used to play store with. But I think, like calculators, BIM has improved in the past 30 years a whole lot. It's become much more streamlined. It's getting even more impressive, and it's going to be moving past just 3D modeling. The other thing here is halfway down, it's kind of small. I say that competition has gone from a zero-sum game to strategic cooperation. And that's something that Andrea was talking about with IPDs. It also happens with BIM technology. There's going to be a bunch of different disciplines, a bunch of different professionals, and they're going to be contributing to the same BIM model. Cooperation is usually good, although it does make our insurance companies a bit nervous because they don't want to be responsible for someone else's mistakes. But it is something that we hope over time will reduce litigation. For technologies that are related, I may live in a bubble, but I think probably most of you have heard of smart contracts, or at least robotic process automation. A smart contract can best be described as like walking up to a vending machine with change, putting it in, pressing A2, and getting your Diet Coke and walking away and drinking your Diet Coke. That's a perfect contract. And it doesn't require lawyers, and it's automated. So if a smart contract, we're not there yet, we're just at contract automation, but when it's fully smart, it'll be able to work with BIM such that when you reach a milestone in the design, your funds will automatically be released to you. And that's going to be very disruptive if we ever are able to pull it off. And in terms of robotic process automation, we at IBI have been botting anything we can, including parts of my job, which is a bit risky for me. But in terms of BIM, we've been working with BIMBot, and I just heard from Andrea this morning that she gave the award to the wrong person last night, or group of people. We were up for the Innovation Award this year. And the reason that BIMBot is great is because it automatically detects clashes, and it lets the right people know. And I understand it keeps pestering the right people until they do something about it, and then the issues are resolved. From a litigation standpoint, what it does is create a record of who should have fixed what when, and when they first got notice. So if you're doing the right thing, it's going to be very helpful. If you ignore those notifications, it's probably going to be less helpful during the litigation. So how you can protect yourself, as Andrea mentioned earlier, the risks are basically the same as they always were. One thing, and you should listen to Peter's good advice on the privacy piece and cyber liability, it definitely does increase that. And in recent years, we've been upping our insurance coverage on cyber liability. You should do the same. Peter did not use his presentation to do a sales pitch, but we've used Aon to get our own cyber insurance and feel confident. They also offer all kinds of services to help you through, so no matter who's insuring you on cyber liability, I bet you they have someone who you can call 24 hours a day who can assist you if you have questions and can help you build your own sort of cyber protection. This is really important. The lawsuits that there are about BIM, which are not really about BIM, but where BIM's mentioned, are basically boiled down to a failure to communicate. That you're not communicating what's in the model, that teams haven't from the outset made sure that they know what's in the model. On our own team, I know that they make sure that they're involved early on a BIM execution plan and make sure during the RFP and bidding phase that the BIM professionals are in the room, because it does happen sometimes that your design colleagues promise something in BIM that maybe can't be accomplished or is going to take longer, or maybe you could offer them a better solution that would be cheaper and it would impress the client. So making sure you get in the room early as a BIM professional is key. I think Farhan, who's sitting in the back, I think he gets himself into like all the meetings about new bids, a new project, a new business, and that's to make sure that he can help them with their pitch on BIM. So it's important to do that within your own company. And careful contracting, certainly the advice that Jason had is correct. One of the major issues, of course, is jurisdiction because of the international work that we do in BIM. And it's one of the easiest things to fix. So during a contract negotiation, whether or not you have a lawyer, usually people don't fight about jurisdiction. So if you change it, you usually will be successful. One horror story I have, and that I tell every time when I talk about jurisdiction, is that we once had a project, I think it was in North America, but our contract said that we would be under French law and a Swiss arbitration. The fight was $500,000 between us on fees. And win or lose, either side was going to have to pay $2 million just to go to the arbitration. So we couldn't afford to fight, which changes how you are able to negotiate a settlement. So that, and if no one had chosen that on purpose, basically no one had looked at that part of the contract. They just assumed from an earlier precedent it was the right. So that's one thing, like word search, jurisdiction. Make sure it's close to home or at least close to where your project is. That's the best thing you can do for yourself. So more Farhan. I rely on him a lot for this stuff. So these are some of the things he told me to do a few months ago when I was giving a presentation on this. And I called him last week and he said he still agrees with his earlier advice. So sharing your lessons learned is really, really important. It's a hard thing to do internally to admit that you've made mistakes, but that's actually how these new processes get better. And you have to, like in law firms, we share our failures all the time. We don't tell outsiders about our failures, but we certainly share our own failures internally, and that's really important. Non-designers in BIM is risky, and I think as it gets more collaborative and you're working with non-traditional design partners, especially on like smart city projects where there'll be like Microsoft as a partner or something, you need to make sure that people don't assume that they know what's going on with BIM. You've got to educate people, make them a little scared, like what we're doing today, right? justify your existence, basically. Communicating with the contractor team is really important. Contractors, I think, are a little bit further behind on the BIM side of things, but are getting up to speed. And certain contracts in certain jurisdictions, certainly in the UK, are now required to be on BIM, whether or not they know what they're doing. So making sure that you're communicating with them and helping them as best you can. Records. So there's all kinds of record keeping that happens in BIM, which is amazing. So it can provide like a forensic record later on of who saw what when and didn't act or did act as they should have, and that's wonderful. But there's all kinds of other things that happen on a project, as you know. You get all kinds of emails outside of that process. And anytime there's something threatening, first of all, you need to respond to it. Always deny liability unless I've sent you the email. And then you want to keep a record of that. Anytime someone's told you to do something beyond your scope, which is another really important point from Andrea's presentation, is making sure that you are involved in both crafting the scope and that everyone that works on your team knows what the scope is. The biggest issue is that young professionals really want to be helpful, and so a client sends them a nasty email saying that they want them to do something, and it's outside of the scope, and people are tempted to do it to please the client. So if they know their scope, at least they can respond and say it's an extra, and you can have that discussion about the money you're owed, and that's a really important piece of it. So I like this quote. Grace Hopper was an early computer scientist and a member of the U.S. Rear Admiralty, and this is her quote. The most dangerous phrase in language is, "We've always done it this way." So don't let anything we're telling you today dissuade you from continuing to innovate, continuing to work in this space. Our job is to catch up with you. Thank you.